So, do you ever think about death? It's hopefully not something that's on your mind all the time, but it's something all living things universally share. How we navigate our relation to death is a pretty integral part of the human experience, diffusing itself into cultural practices of burial and remembrance. Death inevitably finds its way into our art, and games are no exception. Very often, however, death finds itself trivialized. It is turned into something we impart onto others, frequently to serve one specific narrative fantasy: power. As I'm saying this, you've probably thought of dozens of games that do the opposite. Like, I doubt anyone's dying of vehicular manslaughter in Mario Kart, and one such game will be my focus today. But it's not Mario Kart. I want to look at the tools of death. Tools that don't impart death, as with weapons, but rather records it. But to do that, we must first make our way aboard the Obra Dinn. Return of the Obra Dinn, for those who don't know it, is a mystery detective game. Set in the early 1800s, you, as an insurance inspector, are tasked with discerning the fates of the 60 crew members aboard the titular Obra Dinn. The crew are, sadly, mostly missing or dead, and so you're tasked with figuring out what happened to them using two main tools. The first is a pocket watch, the memento mortem, which when used above a corpse lets you travel back in time to the moment of the victim's death. The second, and less remarkable tool, is your journal, which you use to record and speculate on the fates of each of the characters. For each fate, you're asked two main questions. Who was this? How did they die? The game is constructed around solving fates in sets of three, leaving just enough wiggle room for guesswork while still allowing for more concrete and logical deduction. The game ends when you have learned the fates of a minimum of half the crew aboard, at which point you leave the ship and are treated to a more formalized, sterile version of your notes in the journal. This new document details the information you have gathered alongside notes of how much money is paid out by the East India Company and to whom. And that's it. Yep, that's it. That's all it is. Well, okay, there is a secret hidden chapter you unlock if you solve all the fates, but aside from that, there's not much else. If you feel like the way the game presents the crew's death is clinical and reductive, congratulations! You've just felt a bit of the core dissonance that is intentionally woven into the game's narrative. The individual player's interest in the lives and story of those aboard is juxtaposed by the in-world sense of banality inherent to your player character's job. You may be intrigued by the drama of betrayal and death aboard the Obra Dinn, but in the eyes of Company and Crown, they're merely a statistic. People far smarter than me have already made this observation though. Professor Melissa Kagan looks at this juxtaposition in relation to how the game represents its many corpses, highlighting the fact that the PC of Obra Dinn is at work. His gaze at these bodies is professional, he silently observes each scene, then records information as though it were objective, as though it were possible to strip the image of human bias and perspective and ethicality so that it is objective. Kagan analyzes Obra Dinn as a critique of capitalism, which, given the nature of the setting, is a rather unavoidable comparison. You, through the clerk, are working for one of the largest companies in history, one that facilitated the exploitation and death of millions, but for the clerk, it's just Tuesday. That juxtaposition inevitably bleeds into the game's core tools practically from the outset. Our introduction to the pocket watch and journal sees the tools fall into camps of player empathy and player character apathy. The clerk picks up the journal first, a sign that you shouldn't get too attached to what's going on since you have the work to do. Then they pick up the pocket watch and read its evocative inscription: Memento Mortem, remember death. Hello there, this is me during editing. I've realized that how I've scripted this makes it seem like you pick up the watch instantly after you grab the book. That's not the case. The game makes you flick through the journal before you pick up the watch. So I guess my entire point is null and void. Yeah! Obra Dinn both demands you take on a similar detached perspective as the clerk and establishes a need to be invested in the narrative to even solve the puzzle. Of these two tools, let's focus on the pocket watch first, since gameplay-wise it only really has one function: taking the player back in time. We've already established that the pocket watch is a stand-in for player emotional investment, and that is then built upon via the presentation of how you go back in time. When the watch is first used above a corpse, the music swells and the screen displays a swirling transition before everything is cut short.
Captain, open the door!
And the dialogue begins. Within the vignette, new corpses explode into blinding light before an unexplained wisp leads you back in the present to the corpse's resting place. The initial moments of activating the watch over corpses and locating new bodies in each vignette are all tied to a sense of theatricality and ceremony. You are almost reawakening the figure in front of you, giving each story a new corpse tells a sense of reverence. That reverential tone is then undercut by later explorations of the corpses once you've located all aboard the ship. There's no grandeur or flashy transitions, just a curt violin note. And into the vignette you go. To take a step back for a moment, it's clear that the choice to remove the flashier introduction sequence was a practical one. It removes the tedium of having to watch the cutscene play every single time you want to replay a Fate, and since you'll be doing that a lot, it's nice for it to be quick. So yes, it's a practical choice, but it's a practical choice with thematic relevance. The theatricality of the vignettes become mundane, and like the clerk, the potential intrigue surrounding the Obra Dinn's mystery gives way to a need to finish your tasks. This becomes way more pronounced when we come to look at the journal. I don't actually know where the journal is. Oh, here it is. Okay, just give it a second. We good? Yep. Okay, cool. As our main way of interacting with the ship, the journal becomes the focal point of how the entire story is retold to the outside world. It, like the player character, is the final judge on all events, and this is reflected in the presentation of the text. Names and fates, even when they aren't necessarily true, turn from scribbled handwriting to typed letters, and the skull at the journal's end slowly adds new lines of every fate quote-unquote solved. In real time, our deductions and retelling of events simultaneously reduce the significance of individual deaths. Only the aforementioned ledger that you see at the game's conclusion does anything remotely comparable. In Chapter 7 of the journal, The Doom, we see this effect of reduction and bending of truth appear most potently. It's the chapter with the highest number of recorded deaths and missing people, and as such is ripe for narrative uncertainty to grow. Whilst some have their fates more explicitly depicted, many of our doomed crew have their fates left up to reasonable assumption. Some survive, escaping after the Kraken attack, others are torn in half, and a select few contain ambiguous fates. As such, these unlucky crew members are filed under the same eerie fate of being drowned by, quote, a terrible beast. All of Chapter 7 reflect a peak in the fantastical elements of Obra Dinn. Yet once again, the journal, and the player character's judging eye, cuts through the fantasy to eke out the names and fates, all for the job of reporting back to the company. Let's start from the quote-unquote beginning of Chapter 7, as it appears to us to see how this process of judgment evolves over time. Starting at the chapter's end, we see the death of Abigail Whittrell, whose fate seems relatively clear. It's hard to argue against seeing someone be crushed by a piece of the mast. There's the topman Marber, who's torn apart by the beast. Peter Milroy dies in an explosion. Roderick Anderson is crushed by a loose cannon. Christian Wolfe and George Shirley are killed by a misfired cannon. Abraham Akbar is crushed by a questing tentacle, and his death is actually what causes the deaths of Wolfe and Shirley. Edward Spratt is caught in a truly compromising position on the toilet. Finally, as we reach the beginning of the chapter, we see the murder of Lars Lind by a fellow crewman as vengeance for the death of the crewman's brother. I've gone through this chapter in reverse because, for most players at least, that's how you experience the chapter for the first time. It's important to highlight this because throughout all of Obra Dinn, you'll be experiencing the narrative non-linearly. As with all the chapters in the game, how we are presented the events aboard the ship pigeonholes us into thinking linearly. The journal, of course, helps with this. The all-important active reduction ensures that we focus purely on what's important to our job, stitching together a reasonable enough chain of events to report to the company. However, what's happening aboard the ship is anything but linear. Deaths are happening simultaneously across different parts of the ship, and it's only in trying to hammer the chaos into something literally readable that we can discern anything useful from it. Again, that idea of stripping the image of human bias is important to remember, as the journal attempts to piece these events into some kind of narrative. Even the idea of calling the different groups of events chapters serves in trying to impose linearity or some kind of readable narrative onto the events we see. The journal is a chisel, and the Obra Dinn is our block of marble. This is where I think I'll leave the discussion of the game for now. The more you dig into a small game like Obra Dinn, the greater the chance that what you're writing sounds all pretentious. That being said, there's also way more to talk about with the game from a narrative design and aesthetic perspective, like how the emulation of old PC color schemes parallels the historical setting by using a modern anachronism, or its connection to the contemporary mythology surrounding sea monsters. Honestly, I could go on, but, I don't want to be here writing a book about it. Oh shit, that's just like what you do in the